Hashtag no one ever kissed me, said the Apache girl. The cowboy bent down and did it. Arizona Territory, 1887. The unforgiving sun beat down on the rugged landscape where the desert met the mountains, creating a frontier that seemed to swallow men whole. Dan Sloan adjusted his hat, the leather worn from years riding the range. At 25, his face remained unlined despite the harsh elements, his clean-shaven jaw set with determination as he led his horse through the parched terrain. The life of a cowboy had suited him fine, until now. A man who puts down roots is a man who puts down a target, Dan muttered to his horse, a philosophy that had guided him across 3 territories. He'd seen too many settlers broken by Apache raids, drought, or the simple brutality of frontier life. His own parents' homestead had burned when he was 16, their bodies buried beneath simple wooden crosses he'd fashioned himself. Since then, he'd lived by one rule: keep moving, stay alive. The Winchester rifle strapped to his saddle and the Colt revolver on his hip were his only constants. Dan had ridden with 3 different cattle outfits, never staying longer than a season. When cowboys gathered around campfires sharing dreams of land or women, Dan remained silent. The frontier was no place for dreams, only survival. As the sun began its descent toward the jagged mountain peaks, Dan spotted a thin plume of smoke rising from a small valley ahead. Instinct told him to steer clear, but his canteen hung nearly empty at his side. He needed water, and smoke meant people. People who might share their well or direct him to the nearest creek. He approached cautiously, one hand resting on his revolver. The small homestead came into view, a modest cabin with a stone chimney, a corral holding 3 horses, and a small garden plot. What caught his attention, however, was the young woman drawing water from a well. Her long black hair cascaded down her back, and she wore a simple blue dress that stood out against the dusty landscape. As he rode closer, Dan realized the woman wasn't white. Her features and copper skin marked her as Apache, though she dressed in settler's clothing. She looked up as he approached, her dark eyes widening with alarm. She dropped the water bucket and reached for something hidden in the folds of her dress. "Easy now," Dan called, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Just passing through and looking for water." The woman paused, studying him with suspicion. Behind her, the cabin door opened, and an older white man with a gray beard stepped out, rifle in hand. "State your business, stranger," the man called. "Name's Daniel Sloan. I'm heading to Prescott, looking for work with the Diamond Bar outfit. Just need to fill my canteen if you can spare it." The old man lowered his rifle slightly. "Oliver. John Oliver. This here's my place." He gestured to the woman. "That's Elara. She lives here too." Dan nodded politely to both, noting how the woman, Elara, remained tense, her eyes never leaving his face. There was something in her gaze that stirred an unexpected feeling in his chest, a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. "Water's free," John said, nodding toward the well. "But I'd be obliged if you'd look at my horse before you go. Got a limp I can't figure, and you look like you know your way around horses." Dan hesitated. His instinct was to fill his canteen and ride on, but something held him there, perhaps the way Elara watched him, or maybe just the weariness in his bones after 3 days of hard riding. "I can take a look," he agreed, dismounting. As he approached the well, Elara stepped back, maintaining distance between them. "You're Apache," Dan said quietly as he filled his canteen. "My mother was," she replied, her English perfect but accented. "My father was a soldier." Dan nodded, sensing there was more to her story but not wanting to pry. "How old are you, miss?" 20, she answered, lifting her chin slightly. "And you need not call me miss. I am Elara." Something about her directness caught him off guard. Most women he encountered in frontier towns were either married settlers who eyed him with suspicion or saloon girls with practiced smiles. Elara was neither. She stood with quiet dignity, unafraid to meet his gaze. As Dan examined John's lame horse, he learned that the old man had taken in Elara 5 years earlier after finding her alone and injured near an abandoned Apache camp. Her people had been relocated to the San Carlos Reservation, but she had somehow been left behind. Rather than turning her over to the authorities, John had offered her shelter at his homestead. "Best decision I ever made," John said as they watched Elara tending the garden. "Girl works harder than any ranch hand I've known. Smart, too. Reads better than I do." Dan removed a stone from the horse's hoof, and applied a poultice of herbs Elara had provided. By the time he finished, the sun had nearly set, and John insisted he stay for supper. "No sense riding in the dark when there's food and a place by the fire here," the old man said, brooking no argument. That night, as they ate a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and rabbit stew, Dan found himself watching Elara. She spoke little, but her eyes missed nothing. When their gazes met across the table, neither looked away immediately, and Dan felt something stir within him. A curiosity, a warmth he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Later, as John snored by the fire, Dan stepped outside for fresh air. Elara stood by the corral, looking up at the stars. "Your horse will be fine by morning," she said without turning. "The swelling is already down." "Thank you for the herbs," Dan replied, keeping his distance. "I've never seen that mixture before. My mother taught me. She was a healer among our people." A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with unspoken questions. "Where will you go after Prescott?" she asked finally. Dan shrugged. "Wherever there's work, I suppose. Never been one to stay in one place too long." "You are running from something," Elara observed. Not a question, but a statement. Dan stiffened. "What makes you say that?" "Your eyes. They are always looking over your shoulder, even when there is nothing there." Her perception unsettled him. "The frontier's no place for putting down roots," he said firmly. "Man gets comfortable, he gets careless. Careless gets you killed." Elara turned to face him fully. "Is that what happened to your family?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "How did you?" "You touched the inside of your vest 3 times during supper. There is something there you carry, something precious, and there is grief in your eyes when you touch it." Dan's hand moved unconsciously to his vest, where a small daguerreotype of his parents was tucked in an inner pocket. "They were killed by raiders. Our homestead in Texas. I was 16. I am sorry," she said simply. "Loss leaves marks on the soul that others can see, if they know how to look." Before Dan could respond, a sound in the distance made them both turn. Riders approaching, at least 3, moving fast. "Get inside," Dan said, reaching for his revolver. "Wake John." Elara didn't move. "They are not Apache," she said, listening. "White men's horses. Iron shoes." Dan strained his ears and realized she was right. The approaching riders were mounted on shod horses, not the unshod ponies favored by the Apache. Within minutes, 3 men rode into the yard. Even in the moonlight, Dan could see they were rough characters, trail-worn clothes, unshaven faces, and guns worn low for quick drawing. "Evening, folks," called the lead rider, a tall man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw. "Sorry to trouble you so late, but we're looking for a girl. Apache girl, about 20. Seen anyone matching that description?" Dan felt Elara tense beside him. His hand remained near his gun. "Can't say we have. What's your business with her?" The scarred man smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Army business. Got papers saying she belongs at San Carlos with the rest of her kind. Been tracking her for 2 days." Dan knew immediately the men were lying. Army scouts wouldn't ride at night, and official business would be conducted by uniformed soldiers, not these rough-looking men. "Like I said, haven't seen any Apache around here," Dan replied evenly. "Just me and the old man who owns this place." The cabin door opened, and John emerged, shotgun in hand. "Everything all right out here?" "These men are looking for someone," Dan called, never taking his eyes off the scarred man. "Told them we haven't seen anyone." John's weathered face revealed nothing as he approached. "That's right, just us here." The scarred man's eyes narrowed as they swept over the homestead, lingering on Elara. "And who might you be, miss?" Before Elara could answer, John spoke up. "She's my daughter. Got her mother's looks, but she's mine right enough." The lie hung in the air. Even in the dim light, no one would believe Elara was the biological daughter of the white-haired old man. "That's so." The scarred man chuckled. "Funny, I heard John Oliver lived alone. Heard he might be harboring a young Apache woman. Worth good money to the right people." Dan stepped forward, positioning himself between Elara and the riders. "Think you boys better move on. Night's getting cold, and so's our supper." The atmosphere grew tense as the scarred man evaluated his options, eyes moving from Dan's ready stance to John's shotgun. Finally, he nodded. "We'll be back tomorrow with more men. Army's paying $50 for the return of every Apache not on reservation land. That girl ain't white, whatever story you're spinning." The riders departed, dust swirling in their wake. Once they were out of earshot, Dan turned to Elara and John. "Bounty hunters," he said grimly. "They'll be back, and they'll bring trouble." John nodded, his face lined with worry. Been dreading this day. Too many men making money hunting down strays from the reservation. "I should go," Elara said quietly. "They will hurt you for helping me." "Nonsense," John replied firmly. "This is your home." Dan looked between them, feeling the weight of decision pressing down. Every instinct told him to saddle up and ride out. This wasn't his fight. Yet something held him there. The memory of his own home destroyed, his own family taken. And something else too. The way Elara had seen through him so easily, recognizing the grief he carried. "You both need to leave by first light," Dan said finally. "Those men weren't army scouts. They're selling people to whoever pays. Might be the reservation, might be worse." "Where would we go?" John asked, sounding suddenly old. "This is all I have. Started over here after the war took everything else." Dan hesitated, his mind racing. The smart play was to ride out alone. But the thought of leaving them unprotected stirred something he'd tried to bury years ago. A sense of responsibility, of connection. "I know a place," he said finally. "Old line shack in the mountains near Prescott. Cattle outfit I worked for uses it in summer, but it'll be empty now. You'd be safe there while I ride to the marshal in Prescott. Tell him about these bounty hunters." Elara studied his face. "Why would you help us? You said yourself the frontier is no place for putting down roots or forming attachments." Dan couldn't answer the question fully, not even to himself. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when good people don't stand together out here." That night, as John slept, Dan and Elara prepared for departure, gathering supplies and planning their route. Working side by side in the quiet cabin, Dan found himself drawn to her deliberate movements and quiet strength. "How did you survive?" he asked softly. "After your people were taken." Elara paused in her packing. "I was sick when the soldiers came. My mother hid me in a cave with medicines before they took everyone. She said she would return, but..." Her voice trailed off. "I waited 3 days before trying to find them. Then fever took me again. John found me half dead a week later." Dan felt a surge of anger at the casual cruelty of a world that tore families apart. "You never tried to join them at San Carlos?" She shook her head. "The ones who go there do not come back. And stories travel. Disease, hunger, guards who..." She didn't finish the thought. "John gave me a home, taught me to read English, to live in 2 worlds." As she spoke, Dan realized that Elara, like himself, was a survivor of frontier violence. Yet unlike him, she hadn't closed herself off. She had built a new life, formed a new family with John, learned to bridge 2 worlds while he had been running for years, touching nowhere and no one. Dawn broke with a silent understanding between them. They would leave together, 3 unlikely companions bound by circumstance and the harsh demands of frontier survival. As they loaded John's wagon and prepared to depart, Elara paused by the garden she had carefully tended for years. "We will find a new place," Dan assured her, surprising himself with the promise. "Better land, better water." She smiled for the first time since he'd met her, a subtle curve of her lips that transformed her face. "Perhaps," she said, "but it is not the land that makes a home." The words stayed with him as they set out, Dan riding ahead as scout, while John drove the wagon with Elara beside him. They took a less traveled route into the mountains, hoping to avoid the bounty hunters who would surely return to find the homestead abandoned. For 3 days they traveled, making slow progress on rough trails. Each night, as they camped beneath the stars, Dan found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone, about his parents, about the years of drifting, about the emptiness that had become his constant companion. Elara listened without judgment, occasionally offering insights that cut to the heart of his pain. "You think being alone keeps you safe?" she said on the 3rd night as they sat by the fire. "But the heart withers without connection, like a plant without water." Dan wanted to dismiss her words, but they resonated too deeply. In her presence, he felt something awakening, a longing for more than mere survival. On the 4th day, as they crested a ridge overlooking a valley thick with ponderosa pine, disaster struck. The wagon caught on a rock, snapping the axle. As the wagon tilted dangerously, John was thrown clear, but his leg twisted beneath him with a sickening crack. Dan and Elara rushed to his side. The old man's face was gray with pain, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Broken, Elara said after examining it. He cannot travel like this. Dan surveyed their situation grimly. They were exposed on the mountainside, at least a day's ride from the line shack. Night would fall in a few hours, and the temperature would drop dangerously. We need shelter, he decided. I'll scout ahead, see if there's a cave or overhang where we can make camp. While Elara tended to John, Dan rode out, searching the rugged terrain. An hour later, he returned with news of a small cave a half-mile ahead. Using a travois fashioned from the wagon's sideboards, they carefully transported John to the cave. As night fell, Elara prepared a poultice for John's leg and set the bone as best she could. The old man bore the pain stoically, but his condition was clearly serious. He needs a doctor, Elara whispered to Dan as John finally slept, aided by willow bark tea. The break is bad, and he is not young. Dan nodded, calculating distances and dangers. Prescott's still 2 days' ride. I could make it in one if I push hard. And leave us here? Fear flashed across Elara's face. Just long enough to bring back help, Dan assured her. You'll have my rifle, plenty of ammunition. Elara looked toward John's sleeping form. If those men find us. They won't, Dan promised, though he couldn't be certain. I'll leave at first light. Be back with help before you know it. That night, as they sat at the mouth of the cave keeping watch, the chill mountain air drew them closer together. Elara wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and when Dan shifted closer to share his warmth, she didn't pull away. I have never understood why my people and yours cannot live in peace, she said softly, gazing at the stars. The land is vast enough for all. Fear, Dan replied after a moment. Fear and greed. Powerful forces. More powerful than humanity? Than kindness. Dan had no answer. His life had been shaped by violence and loss, leaving little room for hope in humanity's better nature. Yet sitting beside Elara, feeling her warmth against his side, he wanted to believe in the possibility of something better. When I was 16, he said slowly, after my parents were killed, I tracked the raiders for 2 weeks. Found them camped by a river. There were 5 of them. I shot 3 before they knew what was happening. Elara remained silent, letting him speak. The other 2 ran. I could have let them go, but I didn't. I hunted them down, one by one. He swallowed hard. Last one begged for his life. Said he had children. I shot him anyway. He waited for her judgment, her horror, but Elara simply placed her hand over his. And did killing them bring your parents back? She asked gently. Dan shook his head. It didn't even bring me peace. Just emptiness. Been carrying it ever since. So you wander, thinking if you never stop moving, the emptiness cannot catch you. She turned to face him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. But it travels with you, does it not? The truth of her words pierced him. For years he'd been running, not just from danger, but from connection, from the possibility of loss. Yet the emptiness had been his most faithful companion all along. What about you, he asked. Don't you carry anger for what happened to your people? Elara was quiet for a long moment. I carry grief, she finally said. But my mother taught me that hatred is a poison that kills the vessel that holds it first. I choose to live, Daniel Sloan. Truly live, not merely survive. As she spoke, Dan felt something shift within him, a crack in the walls he'd built around his heart. Before he could respond, a sound in the distance made them both tense. Horses approaching. Dan reached for his revolver, moving to the cave entrance. In the moonlight, he could make out riders coming up the trail they had followed, at least 5 men, moving with purpose. The bounty hunters, Elara whispered beside him. They followed our trail. Dan's mind raced. They were trapped in the cave with a badly injured man and limited ammunition. Even if he could hold them off for a while, daylight would only worsen their position. Is there another way out? He asked urgently. Elara shook her head. I explored while you were hunting. The cave goes back about 30 feet, then ends. Dan made a quick decision. Wake John. Get him as far back in the cave as possible. Take my rifle. What are you going to do? Buy us some time. He checked his revolver, making sure all 6 chambers were loaded. When I engage them, there'll be confusion. If it goes badly, there's a narrow ravine east of here. Follow it down to the creek, then head north toward Prescott. Elara gripped his arm. No, we stay together. The determination in her eyes matched his own, and for a moment, Dan allowed himself to imagine a different future, one where he wasn't alone, where this brave, perceptive woman remained by his side. The thought gave him strength. Together, then, he agreed. But we need a plan that doesn't end with us all dead or captured. As the riders drew closer, Dan and Elara quickly prepared their defense. They positioned John behind a rock formation deep in the cave, giving him the shotgun. Dan would take position near the entrance, while Elara would use her knowledge of Apache tactics to create a diversion if needed. The bounty hunters stopped about 50 yards from the cave, clearly aware of their presence. The scarred man's voice carried in the night air. "We know you're in there, Oliver. Send out the Apache girl, and we'll let you and your friend ride away." "Go to hell," Dan shouted back. "She's not property to be handed over." A harsh laugh echoed off the rocks. "She's worth $50 to the reservation agent, more to others with different interests. Your choice how this goes." Dan glanced at Elara, seeing fear in her eyes, but also resolute courage. No matter what happened, he wouldn't let these men take her. The standoff continued for several tense minutes. Then Dan noticed something. Two of the bounty hunters were circling around, attempting to find a position above the cave entrance. "They're trying to flank us," he whispered to Elara. Before they could adjust their defense, gunfire erupted, not from the bounty hunters, but from somewhere behind them. Shouts of confusion filled the air as two of the hunters fell from their saddles. "What the hell?" Dan peered out, trying to understand what was happening. Through the chaos, new riders appeared. 3 men wearing the badges of U.S. Marshals. The remaining bounty hunters scattered, fleeing into the night as the lawmen pursued. When the gunfire subsided, a voice called out, "Daniel Sloan, you in there?" Dan approached the cave entrance cautiously. "Who's asking?" A man dismounted, hands visible. "Marshal Robert Jenkins from Prescott. Got word from a rancher that bounty hunters were working these parts illegally. Been tracking them for days." Relief flooded through Dan as he holstered his weapon. "We've got an injured man in here. Older fellow with a broken leg." As the marshals helped transport John down the mountain to Prescott, Dan learned that the bounty hunters had been operating for months, capturing Apache people who weren't on reservations and selling them, sometimes to the government for the bounty, sometimes to private parties for other purposes. The marshal had been building a case against them for weeks. In Prescott, John received medical attention, but the doctor was grim about his prospects. Legs badly broken, and at his age, there's infection setting in. He needs rest, good care, and a lot of luck. Dan arranged rooms at the hotel for them all, using money he'd saved from his last cattle drive. As days turned into weeks, he postponed joining the Diamond Bar outfit, instead finding odd jobs in town to support their stay while John slowly recovered. During this time, Dan and Elara grew closer, their shared experiences creating a bond unlike any he'd known. They spent evenings talking by John's bedside, walked through town together despite the stares their unusual pairing attracted, and slowly began imagining a future neither had dared consider before. One evening, as they sat on the hotel's back porch watching the sunset, Elara asked a question that caught Dan off guard. "Why did you stay?" "Your path was taking you elsewhere." Dan considered the question carefully. "At first, I stayed because you both needed help. Then because John needed time to heal." He paused, gathering courage. "Now I stay because I can't imagine riding away from you." Elara's eyes widened at his admission. "You once said the frontier is no place for putting down roots." "Maybe I was wrong," Dan replied softly. "Or maybe it's not about the place, but the people you choose to stand beside." As John's health improved, they faced a new challenge. Word had spread about the Apache woman staying in town, and while the marshal ensured her legal safety, social acceptance was another matter. Store owners refused service, women crossed the street to avoid her, and threatening notes appeared under their hotel room door. One afternoon, returning from the doctor's office, they found a crowd gathered outside the hotel. A preacher stood on a crate, his voice raised in condemnation. "The good book teaches separation of the races. This Apache woman living among decent folk is an abomination, and the men harboring her are no better." Dan felt Elara stiffen beside him. His hand moved instinctively to his revolver, but she placed her hand over his, stopping him. "Words cannot harm me," she said quietly. "This man's hatred is his burden, not mine." Her dignity in the face of such vitriol humbled Dan. As they pushed through the crowd, ignoring the hostile stares and muttered insults, he realized how much he had to learn from her, about courage, about integrity, about true strength. That night, as a storm raged outside their hotel, John called them to his bedside. His recovery had been slow, and though the immediate danger had passed, he remained weakened. "I've been thinking," the old man said, his voice thin but determined. "My homestead's gone, and truth is, I'm too old to start again from scratch." "We'll help you rebuild," Dan assured him. John shook his head. "No, son. My time for building is past. But you too. You've got years ahead." He reached for Elara's hand. "I've watched you both these past weeks. There's something growing between you, plain as day." Elara glanced at Dan, a question in her eyes that made his heart race. "I've got a brother in California," John continued. "Fruit orchard near Sacramento. Been asking me to join him for years. Think maybe it's time I took him up on it." "You want to leave Arizona?" Elara asked, surprise evident in her voice. "Want you both to have a fresh start," John replied. "There's good land northwest of here, near the mountains. Better water, fewer people with long memories and short tempers." That night, after John had fallen asleep, Dan and Elara stood by the window watching lightning split the sky. The storm outside matched the tumult of emotions within Dan. Hope and fear, desire and doubt, all warring for dominance. "Do you think John is right?" he asked finally. "About us, I mean." Elara turned to face him, her expression open and vulnerable in a way that took his breath away. "I have felt something growing between us since that first night you rode to the homestead. A recognition, perhaps. Two souls who have walked similar paths of loss." Dan stepped closer, drawn by a force he no longer wanted to resist. "I've been running so long, I'd forgotten what it feels like to want to stay somewhere. With someone. And now," her voice was barely above a whisper. "Now I'm terrified," he admitted honestly. "Not of bounty hunters or hostile townsfolk, but of how much I've come to care for you. Of how much it would hurt to lose you." Elara reached up, her fingers gently touching his cheek. The Apache believed that true courage is not the absence of fear, but acting with a good heart despite it. In that moment, with rain lashing the windows and thunder rolling across the sky, Dan made his choice. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Elara closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that felt like coming home after years in the wilderness. When they finally parted, Elara's eyes were bright with emotion. "No one ever kissed me before," she said softly. Dan smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "No one?" She shook her head. "My people were taken when I was 15. And since then," she gestured to the window, to the town beyond that had made its hostility clear. "Their loss," Dan murmured, drawing her close again. "And my incredible fortune." As spring arrived, bringing new life to the high desert, Dan, Elara, and John made their plans. John would travel to California once his strength returned, while Dan and Elara would seek land to the northwest, near the mountains where water was more plentiful and settlers fewer. The marshal, who had become a friend during their stay, helped secure Elara's legal status as a free person not subject to reservation confinement. The documentation wouldn't prevent prejudice, but it would protect her from future bounty hunters. Before departing Prescott, Dan and Elara stood before a justice of the peace, John serving as witness. Their marriage was simple but profound, a declaration that the barriers of race and past that dominated frontier thinking would not define their future. "You may kiss your bride," the justice said, clearly uncomfortable with the union he'd just sanctioned. Dan bent down, tenderly kissing the woman who had transformed his understanding of courage and connection. "No one ever kissed me until you," Elara had told him. Now, as his wife, she would never lack for affection or protection again. They found their land 3 days' ride from Prescott, a valley sheltered by mountains, with a year-round creek and soil rich enough for crops. Using Dan's savings and money John insisted on giving them as a wedding gift, they purchased the claim from a discouraged settler heading back east. That first summer was hard work, building a cabin, clearing land for crops, establishing their presence in this remote corner of the territory. There were difficult moments, suspicious neighbors, harsh weather, and the countless challenges of frontier life. But for the first time, Dan faced these obstacles not alone, but with a partner whose strength and wisdom complemented his own. Letters arrived regularly from John in California, reporting that his health was improving in the milder climate of his brother's orchard. "You two have given this old man something to live for," he wrote, "knowing you found each other and built something good." By their first anniversary, the homestead had transformed. A sturdy cabin with glass windows, fields yielding corn and beans, fruit trees starting to take root, and a corral holding horses Dan was training for sale. They were not wealthy, but they were building something that mattered. On a warm evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Elara took Dan's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "We will need to build another room," she said, her eyes alight with joy. "By winter, we will be 3. Dan felt tears spring to his eyes as the full meaning of her words registered. A child, a family, the very things he had convinced himself were impossible in this harsh frontier. "Are you happy here?" he asked, suddenly needing to know. "With this life we've built? With me?" Elara leaned against him, her presence an anchor in a world that had once seemed so unforgiving. "I have found my home," she said simply. "Not in this place, though it is beautiful. Not even in this house, though we built it with our hands. My home is here." She placed her hand over his heart. 5 years later, their homestead had grown into a small ranch, known throughout the region for its fine horses and the couple who defied convention by building a life that bridged 2 worlds. Their daughter, Sarah, had her mother's dark eyes and her father's quick smile. Their son, Thomas, born 2 years later, toddled after his sister, determined to keep up. Visitors to the ranch often remarked on the unusual blend of cultures evident in their home. Apache medicines hanging alongside John's old rifle, traditional baskets beside leather-bound books, 2 languages spoken with equal respect. When neighboring ranchers faced trouble, sickness, drought, or raiders, the Sloan family was known to offer help without hesitation. And when Apache families passed through, displaced and searching for new homes away from the reservation's hardships, they found temporary shelter and guidance at the ranch. "You've created something remarkable here," Marshall Jenkins commented during a visit. "A bridge where most people only see a divide." Dan watched Elara teaching their children which plants could heal and which could harm, knowledge passed down from her mother, now preserved for a new generation. The emptiness that had driven him for so many years was gone, replaced by a fullness he'd never imagined possible. "I spent years believing the frontier was no place for love," Dan replied. "Thought survival meant staying detached, keeping moving. Turns out, I had it backwards. Out here, love isn't a luxury. It's the only thing that makes survival worthwhile." As dusk fell, Dan joined his family by the garden Elara had carefully tended. Taking his wife's hand, he bent down to kiss her as their children giggled. "That never gets old," Elara murmured against his lips. Dan smiled, remembering the words she'd spoken on that fateful night years ago. "No one ever kissed me," said the Apache girl. The cowboy bent down and did it. "And I never planned to stop," he promised, gathering his family close as the first stars appeared above their home, a light in the wilderness where once there had only been darkness.